Nigeria's debt issue has been on the front burner for weeks now, following recent reports by the Debt Management Office of Nigeria, which showed that the country's debt stock increased from 21.7 trillion naira in December of 2017 to 22.7 trillion naira as at March 31st, 2018.
But despite the rise in debt stock, the federal government has been unable to develop a new debt management strategy 7 months after the expiration of the DMO's 5-year third strategic plan. Yet there is a possibility of the debt portfolio further increasing, following the agreement Nigeria signed with France for $475 million loan facility to finance some projects in Lagos, Kano and Ogun states.
Yes, indeed. Now, every year, the federal government spends trillions of naira on debt servicing, a trend that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund fears Nigeria might not be able to sustain for too long. In the 2018 budget, the federal allocated that's the federal government set aside 2.2 trillion naira for debt servicing. All right, we have been joined by Chief Economist of Vertiva Capital Management, Michael Famoroti. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Morning. Pleasure to be here.
All right, I hope you'll be able to help us make sense of all of this. According to the World Bank, Nigeria's 63% debt to revenue ratio is very high, way too high.
Yes, it is. I mean, the estimates range, the precise number ranges from about 30 to 60%.
Okay.
But the DMO's threshold is somewhere around 25%.
Yes.
So the idea is that beyond that level, you're putting yourself in a bit of a problem. But it's important to note actually that the debt servicing ratio is just a comparison of how much we spend on debt versus how much revenue we bring in. And in Nigeria's situation, actually, the problem isn't necessarily how much we're spending on debt servicing, but comes really when we look at how much we're earning. So we are an economy that is worth about 100 trillion naira, and government revenues or federal government revenues have never really surpassed 5 trillion. That's less than 5%. And when you consider that, you then begin to understand why our debt servicing looks so big compared to our revenue. So I always like to say that, yes, we may have a debt servicing problem, but more especially, we have a revenue generation problem.
All right, but in 2017, that would be last October or so, Catherine Patillo, IMF chief of fiscal policy, expressed concern that 2/3 of Nigeria's tax revenue was used to service debts annually. That was a concern that was raised by an external body. Why is no one listening?
So, I mean, people are listening. The question is what to do about it. So Nigeria is in a position where it needs money to fund its infrastructure, especially. We haven't even begun to look at issues of education and health and how little we dedicate to that. So I think the health budget is generally less than 3% of the year. So we have so many projects that we need to do, and the reality is that the government brings in too little money. If you take our oil, which is still about 40% of revenues, then taxes contribute very little. I think total tax revenue is possibly like 4 trillion naira or something now. You have countries like South Africa where taxes are about 20% of their GDP. In Nigeria, we're about 5% and one of the lowest in the world. So the reality is that taxpayers aren't contributing enough, so the government has to look elsewhere. And it's looking at the debt market, and regardless of whether you go to the global space or you borrow locally, you're going to have to pay interest rates, and that is what is pressuring our debts. And when you also take into account the fact that in the last couple of years oil prices crashed, so our revenues fell, that explains why the debt servicing ratio shot up like that.
So when you talk about the question of, it's not the issue of piling up the debt, but actually revenue the revenue end of it is where the issue is. But let's even look at some of the measures that the federal government says it's putting in place, apart from going the external angle of it to borrow, because it's a lot cheaper. We've heard that the proceeds from the 2.50 billion borrowing will be converted to Naira and used to redeem the more expensive domestic debt.
Debts.
How easy will that be, and how realistic really is it?
Yeah, so just before I answer that,
Yes.
let me just clarify. So the debt problem is twofold. So the debt servicing ratio is debt servicing compared to revenue.
Yes.
My point was that a lot of times we focus on the first part, which is debt.
Instead of the revenue.
Well, instead of both, because both
Okay.
are relevant. Because if you want to bring down your debt servicing ratio, you can bring down your debts, or you can bring down your revenue, or you can take over your revenue,
take it up.
or do both. A lot of times we fixate on the first one when we may not have the leeway to do so because of our infrastructure gap, whereas there is money in the economy to be raised if we are a bit smarter about our revenue
How would that
generation.
be?
All right. Michael, well, does it concern you, as you and I know, there is nothing wrong borrowing at all, but borrowing for the right purpose and then using it for what it is meant for. Nigeria consistently borrows, but have we felt the impact of the borrowings?
Frankly, no. Historically, Nigeria has been caught borrowing to pay salaries sometimes, which is, a cardinal
Which is
rule
a
of
disaster.
finance. Yes, you do not borrow to pay off your current expenditure. You borrow for investing. I think in the last couple of years, with the shift towards more capital projects, we have seen more discipline in terms of what borrowing is used for. I think the best example perhaps is the sukuk that was raised last year.
Yes.
We know that money, about 100 billion, was dedicated to certain road projects. So that's best practice. But generally, we haven't always borrowed for the right reason, and that's part of why we still have the problems that we do, and it's part of why we haven't been able to generate revenues, because if you borrow and you fund infrastructure, you fund power and all these things, eventually that flows through to government revenues.
So how do we, the most important question then would be, how do we break this vicious cycle of, massive debt? It just keeps rising and rising. On the one hand, yes, we hear that our forex reserves are going up compared to what we are owing and how we need to service the debt.
Yeah, I think there are three things that must be done.
Yeah.
The first actually involves us as taxpayers, and that is, I always recommend that we need to take the first step in terms of paying taxes. So a lot of people say, why do I pay taxes if the government's not going to spend well? Yes, the government does not necessarily spend well, but it's a chicken and egg situation.
Which one
has
comes
to
first?
come first, and the government is probably not going to change. And the reality is, if you do have a government or a policymaker who is interested in spending well, he doesn't have the funds because you haven't been paying your taxes. So you don't even give him the chance to prove himself. But then the government has two things that they must do. The first is, as they borrow, they must borrow wisely. So they must identify the proper project, just like you said, for borrowing, but they must also borrow from the right places. So yes, they're shifting to external debt, and interest rates abroad are cheaper, but if you have a 1-year treasury bill and you're paying 16%, and you go to the external market and you borrow a Eurobond, a 10-year one, and you're paying 5%, yes, 5% is cheaper, but that's over 10 years. In 10 years, so much can happen, and you're exposing yourself to that long-term risk that we may not have considered. And then finally, they must obviously spend the borrowed funds on the right projects, and perhaps that is the toughest of them all.
Yeah.
And it is instructive what you said, that the right project must be identified, and then so that it is very well funded with the loan that is taken. An example is Iceland. Iceland got a loan for ICT, industry, and then they utilized it, and that debt, has been paid off, from money realized from that sector. So it is very instructive to identify the real
right
projects,
kind of projects.
the right kind of projects, and then utilize the money as well. But in 2006, thereabout, in 2005, 2006, after the Paris
Club
death, relief, the Nigeria's debt stood at about $3 billion or so, and then domestic debt at $1 trillion. And Adeosun very rightly recognized that the capacity of the country to service debt is lower than that of the rest of the country. So if this is the case, then why do we not manage our affairs within the confines
of what
we generate as revenue?
Well, that is always an option, but if you do that, you constrain your long-term growth potential, because it takes a while for revenues to pick up. People aren't going to start paying taxes the next day. So the reality is that if you do
but
actually
tax is not the only way to generate funds, is it?
Well, taxes are, in the best economies, taxes should form the bulk of your fund. So if you're relying on commodities like we've done for the past 40 years, then you're setting yourself up for disaster, something that we're familiar with. So you want to generate the bulk of your government revenues from taxes, because those are the most stable, or that is the most stable form of revenues.
But have we been able to demonstrate that really we can handle it, that it's really no cause for alarm, that the economy is not as vulnerable as we may think, that the federal government is not able to meet its debt obligations? Because there's the other danger: if we're not able to, then future borrowings may be at risk.
Yeah, so I don't like to be a cynic, but the reality is that I can't say yes to that, because the most practical experience we had was the Paris Debt Club release, which wasn't positive for us. Although yes, it turned out okay, but it showed that when we borrowed, we couldn't pay back, and that's why they gave us the relief. Now, obviously, we've become a bit more disciplined since then, but the size of the debts is also way more than what we had then. And, except the government actually does pull through with its plans, it's hard to see this not becoming some sort of an issue in the future, particularly because we've shifted to external debt. And if there's any currency depreciation and a fall in oil prices, then we're in quite serious problems.
Michael, I'm reminded of the words of Plato, who said the state is individual writ large. What that means is that the individual mirrors the state. As an individual, when you borrow to an extent, we have heard people who borrowed to an extent, they couldn't pay, and they ended in suicide missions. Will Nigeria, where we are heading at the moment?
Is it suicidal?
It's risky. It's not suicidal, but it's risky. And for us to mitigate that risk, we need good governance, and we need taxpayers to be able to recognize that on time and also contribute. If that doesn't happen, then we're going to be here in, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years talking about, we have a serious debt burden problem, and we may not be able to pay back.
So now, what's happened to the whole diversification drive of government? Because you continue to hammer on the issue of taxes. Yes, taxes are the way to go. We've been told even our VAT are about the lowest in the world. The World Bank, the IMF has said we need to jack it up a little to maybe somewhere around 7% for it to make sense, for it to add some value. But diversification drive, where is that now? Isn't that supposed to help shore up our revenue? Because you were talking about the focus that we seem not to be putting on the revenue side of the whole thing.
Yeah, so the diversification rhetoric is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. But I think what people are looking for is landmarks. So you want to be able to look at the economy in 2018, look at it in 2014 and say, okay, there has been a tangible difference. I think in some respects I think agriculture is possibly the biggest positive, although, the recent challenges there are worrying. But pre-2018, that was probably the one sector that we could have looked at and said, okay, we're reaping some of these diversification efforts. Beyond that, it is hard to see landmarks, and that is possibly why, you know, there's a bit of impatience and doubt regarding that.
And the finance minister, Kemi Adeosun, said new structures in the domestic market, such as the skunk bonds, the infrastructure bonds, inflation-meant bonds, are all strategies put in place to properly manage the borrowings for the next 3 years. Do you think that these are very practicable measures that would work?
Yeah, they are. I mean, they're good. So I mentioned the sukuk earlier, and you know, we should diversify our debts, right? But regardless of the type of debts you have, it all comes down to whether you're able to pay it. So whether it's an inflation-linked bond, a sukuk, or a treasury bill, it all comes down to, okay, when I need to service that debt or repay the principal, do I have the money? And there's only so much creative accounting that you can do to get away from the reality that, okay, maybe I don't have the money to pay this back.
And so then what happens to the economic recovery and growth plan? I mean, with this kind of a debt profile?
Well, so
how realistic is it that we can achieve the targets?
Well, the ramp up in borrowing is actually a part of the plan. So I think one of my challenges with the ERGP was that it was completely silent as to funding. You know, it listed all these 140 something, you know, strategies. Some of them are going to be very expensive, and it was silent as to how they were going to be funded. But we can look at the government's overall borrowing strategy and see that, okay, the plan is to use long-term external debt, but also to try and encourage private sector funding to come in.
External debt, but people must think about debt overhang for future generations, shouldn't they? And there is a sense in which we must also make mention of Senator Sani and Honkui, who blocked RFI's attempts to get more,
some $300 million or so.
more loans, you know, from the outside. They said, look, the state is already owing $230-something million
and nothing to show for it.
Nothing to show for it. Now you want to bring in 300-something million. So if you add that again, then you're having more than 500 million dollar debts on ground. Are you not thinking of how to pay back? So there is a sense in which we must also give credit to them, shouldn't we?
I think the key thing that you guys said was that there has been nothing to show for it, because if I think about the future generation,
we didn't say.
Okay, so I think
senators,
the senators,
3 senators actually from the state. Yes.
If I look at the future generation, or my generation really, we would not mind debts if we look at the economy and look at the country and can admit to ourselves that our predecessors actually use that money in a productive way. So if in 20, 30 years there's a functioning railway, there's a metro, there's power, all these things, we don't mind that we're paying, you know, 10% of our or 30% of our income to taxes in order to pay back debt.
So accountability is important.
And evidence of the money being used in a productive way to help us. The money being used in a productive way to help us. Because there's no point leaving us with, you know, the same power situation, the same road situation, and no debts.
Of course, we've heard over and over again this debate as to whether the private sector actually should be leading the charge when it comes to borrowing, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Michael Famaroti, Chief Economist, Vertiva Capital Management. Thank you very much indeed for coming to share your thoughts with us.
Pleasure.